Hey guys, I took the car back to the dyno last summer and I wanted to go through some of the results. We chained the thing down to the ground and we put some fans on the front of the car, on the intake of the car and on the engine to cool off the intercooler and the radiator and the engine, and ran it over and over again. Actually, I think we got 31 runs. It was a pretty hot 89-degree day by the time I left. The dyno is supposed to be adjusted for temperature compensation, so it adjusts and compensate for your loss of power due to the hot air. However, it won't really compensate for heat soaking. I will put all of my specs up on the screen here, and go ahead and pause the video if we want to take a look. So it's running E85 intercooled, running an XPZ camshaft and LS7 lifters with 130-pound valve springs. The first couple of runs were a 3.4-inch pulley, but that's with a 5% overdrive balancer. The last couple of runs were with a 2.7-inch pulley, and with a 5% overdrive balancer, that is an equivalent of a 2.56-inch pulley. First, we started off, and he was going to do a fuel calibration with his own external oxygen sensor. And I have already done my fuel calibration, but he did a recalibration. And this is why you guys dyno, because this thing was running like absolute garbage. I was actually running about 3 degrees under stock because I did not want to blow this thing up while I was tuning it on my own earlier. And it only dynoed at about 205 horsepower at the wheels, which is a little bit over what a stock car would have dynoed, but that is just obnoxiously bad. And then he adjusted the fuel to a more optimal fuel level. Every time he adjusted it, it picked up a couple of horsepower until we hit 12.4 AFR, or about 0.84 lambda. It was still picking up power, but I said, don't keep going up. I'd rather stay away from running too lean and blowing up the engine. So then after fuel was calibrated and after it was adjusted to a more optimal level, we went to timing. As you can see here, the curve really smoothed out and picked up so much power when we adjust the timing past about 20 degrees. In fact, with the 3.4-inch pulley, it peaked out at about 25 to 26 degrees. Then I switched over to the 2.7-inch pulley, again 2.56 equivalent. Here are the results of a bunch of runs leading up to it. Once I got to this optimal fuel and timing point, I decided to bump the fuel back down to double check to make sure it was actually still making peak power even with low fuel. When I did bump the fuel back down to 12.0 AFR, or about a 0.8 lambda, it did lose power again, so it verified that the fuel is still optimal. Well, here are the final results. 305 horsepower with 3.4-inch pulley, again 5% overdriven, and 345 horsepower with the 2.7-inch pulley, or the 2.56 equivalent. Now this last run at 345 horse, I did have the torque converter locked, which is something you should not ever do, but I wanted to see what it would do. And it only picked up about 5 horsepower, but it did pick up about 20 foot-pounds of torque. This number is good with me, and I'll explain why later. I picked up about 100 horsepower by dialing in the timing and the fueling really well. I thought it felt pretty fast before, and now it's almost scary fast. I later was looking up how much of a parasitic loss the transmission is on these things, and I could not believe what I found. These things soak up between 18 and 26% of your crank horsepower is how much power you lose. So if you do some of the math, this thing might be making between like 415 and 470 crank horsepower, and that's even after the accessory belt parasitic losses too. Manuals, though, only take, from what I have found, about 10% of the power out, so you only have about a 50 horsepower loss. And I'm going to put the specs back on the screen, and if you guys can spot any conflicting issues with some of these modifications, then please let me know. According to ZZP, this camshaft should be making peak power around 6,700 RPM, and my peak power kept peaking out around 5,700 to 5,900 RPM. So that leads me to believe this thing does not get enough air out of my setup. Maybe I could spin the blower faster, get a bigger blower. It did make 14.5 pounds of boost at 6,000 RPMs. Or maybe something else is going on. Let me know what you think. I did have 1 or 2 runs that sounded kind of strange at the end. It might have just been the way that he let off the throttle, but give it a listen. So anyways, after taking the spare tire and the jack and the floor mats and a couple other things out, I went and scaled the car, and it turned out to be 3,040 pounds with me in it. Pulling up a quick quarter-mile conversion calculator in here, all you need to do is enter in your horsepower and your weight. This thing roughly estimates the quarter-mile elapsed time would be about 12 seconds flat. Of course, it'd probably be a little bit slower due to non-ideal conditions of the track. So after this, I took it out to do a couple of test runs before I took it down to the drag strip. Well, here I am stranded on the side of the road for the first time ever. Transmission gave out on the 1 to 2 shift. It was actually my ZZP 4340 input shaft that broke. They advertised it lasts up to 600 horse. ZZP discontinued that product, no longer sells it. And talking to some guys that are kind of in this game, they seem to think that the 4340 is going to be pretty similar to a stock shaft anyways. One thing I should mention is I did take off pretty much all the torque limiting stuff in the computer, so that probably is what killed me here. But yep, found out the hard way, I guess. So I pulled the thing all back apart again, and I actually sent my transmission into a shop to get rebuilt. Pretty much got the top end package, better hardened input shaft and so on. Transmission shop will guarantee this transmission up to 350 horsepower. So I don't really have a lot of a reason to go above that number in horsepower. The transmission shop actually did put in a 3.29 gear set, so that'll help me out a little bit with my trap speed and quarter-mile time, I think. Now this thing was not shifting very well. It would shift about 1,000 RPM after the commanded shift. Once the guy took it all apart, he found different things going on with the transmission. The first thing was clutches were really badly worn. The second thing was the positive from EP actually had some premature wear on the thrust washers. I only had a couple thousand miles on this. He said that if 2 of them get worn too much, they can weld themselves into the housing and then you can't actually get them out. And he says this is a common problem with them. So he put some bronze washers in here. Also, I put a hardened 4th clutch shaft in here from eBay. Apparently eBay's hardened is not that hard. And that was also showing some premature wear. Anyways, you might have noticed in the last video I've got some projects multiplying here, so I've got plenty on my hands to do. Anyways guys, please thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned for some more videos coming soon, and hopefully a quarter-mile video as soon as I get this thing back together.